All right, so this is going to be our lecture on the chemistry of water, and this is going to be an important concept to understand because, as we know, water is essential for life. It is one of the things astroscientists look for on exoplanets as a sign of a potential environment for living systems to have evolved on. And what we hope to learn from this lecture is why that is true. All right, so the basics of water. We know that oxygen is going to have 6 valence electrons. We know that hydrogen has 1 valence electron. And so when we get 2 hydrogens with 1 oxygen, they are going to covalently bond, making these single bonds. Now, the way that the orbitals are lined up around the oxygen, it is going to place the hydrogens on basically one side of the oxygen atom, making it asymmetrical, if you remember this from the previous lecture. We also know that oxygen has an electronegativity of 3.5, and each hydrogen is 2.1, not 2, as I said in the previous lecture. When we see that, that means the oxygen is going to hog those electrons, making it slightly negative, and the hydrogens become slightly positive. And because it is asymmetrical, we've got this distinct negative side and this distinct positive side, making it a polar molecule. The actual angle in between these hydrogens is 104.5. That is not super significant, other than it is not what an even distribution around an atom would be, which is 109.5. So that again shows a little bit more of the asymmetric nature of water. But the important thing is you've got a distinct negative and a distinct positive, making it polar. That is very significant because what we see here in this picture is we see the slightly negative of the oxygen being attracted to the slightly positive of the hydrogen here being attracted to the negative of the oxygen, and these bonds that are showing up between them, we see them drawn as dotted lines right here, because those are weak hydrogen bonds holding them together. So each water molecule can be attracted to multiple other water molecules, giving it this property of cohesion, which means to stick together. So when we look at this penny right there, we can see that there are many, many, many drops of water on top of that penny, and they are not spilling over the edge because the water is holding itself to itself, and eventually gravity will take over if you continue to add drops and it will spill over. Down here we see a water boatman on top of water, and it's not sinking because the tension of the water, the surface tension, is strong enough to support the weight of that water boatman. You cannot walk on water like this because you are heavier than a tiny insect. But that allows it to skim across because of that surface tension, which is caused by those water molecules being attracted to one another. Now this, up here, back to our penny, if you took a drop of soapy water and you put the soapy water on there, that would completely disrupt that surface tension and the water would just fall right off. Because what the soap does, it helps break these bonds between the water and allow it to interact with other things. And we'll talk about soap and polarity a little bit later. Another property of water is water's adhesion. And adhesion is water sticking to other things. So we see in this spider web, all the water droplets from the moisture in the air clinging to it because the proteins in that web are going to be hydrophilic, which means they are water loving, and the water will then stick to those proteins and cling to it and form those drops. On the right, we see this microscopic view of a cross-section of a plant stem. And these are all the little tiny tubes that draw the water up through the plant. These tiny tubes are called xylem, and the tubes are made out of cellulose, which is essentially wood fiber. Here in this picture, we see the process of transpiration. This is the movement of water through the plant, from the roots through the stems to the leaves. So down in the roots, down here, we see water being drawn in through the roots, and it enters into the xylem cells. That is going to be accomplished due to osmotic pressure, which we'll talk about when we talk about cellular transport. But inside the xylem, we see that the water molecules are sticking to each other, so that's cohesion right there. But the water molecules are sticking to the sides of the cellulose by adhesion. Now this is important because this forms a long chain of molecules, and as one molecule of water inside the leaf exits the xylem and then evaporates out through the pores of the leaf, which are called the stomata, or the stoma, or the stomates. As one water molecule leaves, it draws on the water molecule behind it, and it keeps dragging it up like a chain. And that's how the water is drawn up through the leaf and through the xylem from the roots, and it doesn't fall backwards because of the adhesion principle of it sticking to the side of the xylem cells. Now, xylem is made of cellulose, and cellulose is made of glucose, which is a simple sugar. And we know that sugars dissolve in water because they are also hydrophilic, meaning they are water-loving. The reason wood doesn't dissolve is because the chains of the cellulose are so large that they can't be separated into individual molecules inside of the water. But this is very important because other things that are made of cellulose, paper, cotton, clothing. So when you dry off after a shower using a cotton towel, the reason that the water is absorbed into the towel is because it is made of the same stuff as wood, and wood attracts water, and that's what helps dry you off. And of course, you want a terry cloth towel because that increases surface area, so there's more places for the water to absorb into rather than a smooth chamois towel. All right, another important aspect of water is that when it turns into a solid, it is less dense. And because it is less dense, it is going to float. So here on this side, we have liquid water, where everything is just moving around, particles moving quickly as things do in liquids. But as water cools down, it actually is the highest density at 4 degrees Celsius. Once it gets lower than 4 degrees Celsius, the water molecules begin to form this very strict lattice work. And the water molecules, as you can see in this picture, they are farther apart than they are in the liquid stage over here. And so this spacing of the water molecules takes up more volume, even though it has the same mass. And so if we look at our density equation of D equals M over V, if the mass is the same, but we make the volume bigger, then our density is going to go down. And that is why ice floats. Okay, great, ice floats. Why is that important to life? Well, if we look at Mr. Shrimp right here in the middle, and we see this layer of ice above him, or her, don't know, What this means is the ice, because it floats, creates an insulated layer at the top of the lake or the ocean or wherever this little shrimp lives. If ice sank, then the ice would go to the bottom, the top would continue to freeze, it would continue to sink and sink and sink, and then eventually the lake would freeze solid. That is bad for aquatic life because then they would die. What typically happens is you get a layer of ice form, and that creates an insulated layer, and then underneath you have water where the aquatic things can continue to live and breathe rather than being crushed by sinking ice. Water also has the property of having a very high specific heat. Specific heat of a substance is how much energy it takes to change 1 gram of that substance 1 degree Celsius. Keeping in mind that 1 gram of water is 1 milliliter, and that 1 kilogram of water is equal to 1 liter of water. Now, the specific heat of water has a value of 4.184 joules for every gram degrees Celsius. You may see the value 4.185, 4.186, 4.182. That is going to depend on what kind of water you are working with, whether it's pure water, fresh water, salt water, something is dissolved in there that changes the specific heat. Ice has a different specific heat. Steam has a different specific heat. So for what we're talking about, let's just think 4.18 joules of heat. What does that mean? That is equivalent to 1 little c calorie. If you have 1,000 little c calories, you have 1 kilocalorie, which is the same as a food calorie. So 1,000 little c calories is a food calorie. So if you have 4,184 joules, that's the same as a food calorie, and that's how much energy it would take to raise 1 liter of water 1 degree Celsius. So why is it important that water have a high specific heat? Well, it helps with the warming and the cooling of the earth. So as the sun hits the earth, land is going to heat up much faster than water does. So the oceans, being 70% of the surface area of the earth, actually are able to absorb a huge amount of energy without changing temperature too much. And that helps keep the planet from overheating. If we had less water on the earth, the planet would heat up much faster. So then as water warms, it begins to move and cycle, and then you have cooler parts of the earth and warmer parts, and this starts to create ocean currents and move warm and cold water around. That begins to affect the weather and the climate, and it helps. It's kind of like the central heating and air system of the planet, which helps distribute energy throughout the system. Now, one of the issues with climate change is as the water temperature of the ocean is increasing, that begins to affect the weather in more severe ways. So warmer water heats the air above it, and then as the air above the warmer water begins to heat, it begins to spiral and cycle in very large patterns that we call hurricanes. So this increasing of the ocean's water temperature is what leads to bigger and stronger hurricanes, which then cause lots of damage and terribleness. So, other things why this is important, maybe more personally to you if you have never been drastically affected by a hurricane, is the fact that you sweat when you are warm. And as that water comes out of your pores and as it evaporates off your skin, that removes the heat from your body. So when the air is saturated with moisture, when it's really humid and you sweat, that sweat has no place to go because the air is already saturated. So that water just sits on your skin and it can't remove the heat, which is why humid weather feels so much hotter. If it's 90 and humid or 90 and not humid, 90 and not humid is much more comfortable because your body can still sweat and evaporate and cool you off. But when it's humid, that moisture has nowhere to go and it makes you feel awful. And then since you're not cooling down, you get warmer and you sweat more, and it's just kind of gross. So let's talk about alcohol. So ethanol is going to have a specific heat of about 2.46 joules per gram degrees Celsius. Ethanol is what is in hand sanitizer. So when you put that on your hands, it feels cool because it's evaporating very quickly, because it takes much less energy for it to evaporate. So the thing about that is, if you have 1 gram of ethanol and 1 gram of water, the water will actually remove more heat from you and cool you more effectively in the long run than 1 gram of ethanol. And the reason for that, it goes back to molecular chemical structure. Ethanol is 2 carbons and attached to the carbons are going to be some hydrogens, and then this hydroxyl group. This makes this end of the ethanol polar, but this part over here is nonpolar. So the amount of attraction of positive and negatives between one ethanol and another ethanol is actually smaller because you've got a whole end over here that's not attracted to anything. Since there's less attraction, there's less holding these molecules together, which means it takes less energy to break them apart. So it's those bonds between the hydrogens and the oxygens of the water, because the whole molecule is polar, that makes the attraction between them stronger, which means you need more energy to evaporate it and break those bonds. Okay, so the most important property of water is going to be that it is a universal solvent. We say universal because it dissolves lots and lots of things, but it actually doesn't dissolve everything. Otherwise, every time it rained, we would not have cars or houses or dogs or cats or us. But what it means is the chemical nature of water, so most important. The fact that it has a slightly negative side and a slightly positive side is going to make it interact with things that have charges. So things that have charges and like to interact with water are called hydrophilic. Things like salt will dissolve easily in water. Things like sugars, which have charges on them, will also dissolve. And that's because the charges in the ions, the positives and the negatives, the positives will be attracted to the negatives will be attracted to the positives, and the same thing with other polar compounds. They have a slightly negative, they have a slightly positive, and the opposites attract, allowing them to interact. Some things are hydrophilic, but they won't dissolve. Paper, which we said is made of cellulose, is basically long chains of simple sugars, but because they are such long, large chains, they will interact with water, allowing water to bond to it, but it won't dissolve it because the molecules are too big. This is why paper towels work. You can wipe up the water, it absorbs it because of the hydrophilic nature of the cellulose, but it doesn't dissolve because the molecules are too big. If something does not like water, we say it's hydrophobic or water-fearing, and that's because it has no charge. So it is non-polar, so it's a covalent substance with even sharing of electrons, And essentially what happens in a non-polar and polar situation, something like oil and water. So let's say that this is a glass, and at the bottom you have some water, and at the top you have some oil. The water likes itself. The positives and the negatives of the water will interact with one another. And because the oil has no charge, the water basically just ignores the oil, and the oil separates from the water because the water is segregating itself from it. The reason this idea of hydrophilic and hydrophobic is so important in biology is, first, it allows for substances to be dissolved up here. And so inside of the cell, dissolved substances are able to react much faster than things that are still solid. And that allows chemical metabolism to occur at a rate high enough to maintain life's processes. The other main thing that we will talk about in depth is the cell membrane. The cell membrane has components that are both hydrophilic and hydrophobic, and that creates a barrier in between the outside environment and the inside environment, separating the cells so that they can run their metabolic processes. Something that is both hydrophilic and hydrophobic, we say, is amphipathic. So amphi means both, like amphibians, both water and land. And then pathic means nature. So it has two natures. And it's those two natures that regulate what goes in and out of the cell and helps regulate life. When things are dissolving, we see that here is your big crystal, and you have the individual ions. And what happens is the negative ion, so this is sodium chloride, the negative chlorine is surrounded by the positive hydrogens, and the positive sodiums are surrounded by the negative oxygen. So these are called hydration shells, and this is how the ions are pulled away from the salt crystal and go into solution. So if that central thing that's being dissolved is too big, like cellulose, then the water molecules can't surround it. If it is non-polar, the hydrogens or the oxygens aren't going to be attracted to it, so it won't dissolve. And the other reason something might not dissolve is because the attraction between these two ions is stronger than the ability of the water to pull it apart. So things that typically have like a +2 charge, like magnesium carbonate, magnesium is +2, carbonate is -2, that bond is too strong for the water to separate it. So magnesium carbonate is going to be insoluble in water, even though it's ionic. Proteins, which are very, very large molecules, can dissolve in water as well if it's not too big. So in our blood, we've got lots of proteins that will dissolve in water and move through them, and they're going to help regulate lots of different functions. Some of those proteins are clotting factors. So when you get cut, those clotting factors undergo a chemical change, which then makes them insoluble, and they help plug up the cut so that you don't bleed to death. And if you are a hemophiliac, then you may lack some of those clotting factors, and you will continue to bleed, and that is a bad thing. All right, so this is capsaicin. Some of you may know what capsaicin is. This is the hot molecule of hot peppers. And the thing about capsaicin, if you've ever eaten anything really spicy and your tongue and your mouth are on fire and you're wondering, oh God, why did I do this? You want to try to get rid of it, and then you may try to take a drink of water, but that does nothing. And the reason for that is the capsaicin molecule, the overall nature of it, all of this, is nonpolar. You've got one little section down here that will interact with water. So that means when it bonds to your tongue and the inside of your mouth, when you try to drink water, this molecule is not going to be dissolved in the water. It's going to stay on your tongue because your tongue, remember, that's cells, and part of your cells are your cell membrane, which has a nonpolar component to it, so that capsaicin is going to bind to the surface of those molecules in your skin lining your mouth. So that's why it sticks in there and stays in there and is really hard to get rid of. So that's, if you really want to cool your mouth down, that's why people say drink milk, especially whole milk, because whole milk has a much higher fat content, and that will help cool your mouth because that can help move those nonpolar molecules into the fat of the milk and extract them. This is also one of the reasons why if you are maybe cutting up some hot peppers or some jalapenos and you get the juice on your fingers, and if you just wash your hands with water, that's not going to take the capsaicin off your fingers. And then later on, you like rub your eye, and then you're like, oh God, my eye is dying. That's because you did not remove those molecules. So this is where soap is important. Big tangent, but soap has a big nonpolar end. It's a chain of like 16 to 18 carbon-hydrogen bonds. And then at the end, there is a space that has a charge on it that makes it polar. So one end of the soap molecule is polar, the other end is nonpolar. And what soap does, it acts as an emulsifying agent. So if you've got oil or grease on your hands, or maybe some capsaicin, this nonpolar portion is going to interact with the nonpolar compound, oil or capsaicin, and this polar portion right here will interact with water, and it creates a little bridge so that the soap molecule is able to extract the oil off your hand and allow it to mix in with the water. The problem with capsaicin is sometimes it will potentially bind to your skin. So even if you wash your hands with soap and water, there might still be some residue on your skin. So if you are, for some reason, peeling hot peppers with your bare hands, make sure you wash your hands with soap and water very, very thoroughly before you randomly touch your eye and induce agony. Life skills. All right, water is also important because many compounds will dissolve in water, creating acids and bases. Acids are going to, keeping it super simple, they are going to generate hydrogen ions, and then hydrogen ions will interact with hydroxides, which are the bases, and they will neutralize each other. So we measure this on the pH scale or the perhydrin scale, and that is the negative log of the concentration of the hydrogen ions. So if we talk about stomach acid, the concentration of hydrogen ions in stomach acid is about 0.01 molar. If you take the negative log of that, it's a pH of 2. So the thing about the pH scale, it is logarithmic. So going from a pH of 2 to a pH of 1, it's 10 times more acidic. Remembering that our pH scale 0 to 7 is acid, 7 to 14 is a base. You can have negative pHs. You can have pHs higher than 14, but it's typically between 0 and 14 because of the neutral value being 7. So if you have pure water, you are going to have a natural dissociation of water into hydrogen and hydroxide, like that. And that's our equilibrium sign, drawn very messily. But when this happens in pure water, the concentration of hydrogen and the concentration of hydroxide is 0.0000001. If you take the negative log of that, it's going to be a pH of 7 or a pOH of 7. And so when you add the perhydrian and the perhydroxide, then you have a total scale of 14. That's why it's based like that. So pH is critically important in biology because everything happens at specific pHs. Human blood, as we see here, it's about 7.4, and it has to stay there. Changing the pH of your blood drastically will kill you. And that is one of the critical ways that regulates our breathing rate and depth based on how the pH is changing with the change in carbon dioxide levels in our blood. So the big thing about pH is the general biological range is 6 to 8, depending on the enzymes in the living system. There are some things that operate very well at lower pHs, like the enzyme pepsin in our stomach. There are some bacteria that love acidic environments. Those are called the acidophiles, the acid lovers. One of those is Helicobacter pylori, which loves to live in the human stomach and cause stomach ulcers. So if you go above or below these ranges, that can cause death. This is why pickling is a good way to preserve food, because most bacteria cannot survive in a vinegar system. The acidity of the vinegar kills most bacteria and fungi, which preserves the food. However, biological systems have to try to stay within these narrow ranges, so there are lots of things called buffers that help regulate the pH. So in our blood, there are lots of amino acids and proteins that can absorb extra hydrogens or absorb extra hydroxides to keep that range very, very narrow so that we don't die. All right. One of the things that can happen, so again, back to climate change and human problems. So we are generating lots of CO2, burning fossil fuels, cutting down forests so they can't absorb the CO2. What is going to happen, CO2 will naturally diffuse into the ocean. The CO2 will then combine with water to make carbonic acid. That's why it's called ocean acidification, because this will then release hydrogens, making the ocean more acidic. And several things are going to happen. You have certain organisms that cannot tolerate the lower acid range, so they're going to die. But you also have these hydrogens combining with carbonate ions in the water, making more of this bicarbonate ion. Now, why is that bad? Because bicarbonate's a buffer. It can absorb and release hydrogen ions. The problem with this is this carbonate ion, that's what is important for organisms like coral, mussels, oysters, clams. They need that to build their skeletons and their shells for them to survive. So a lack of carbonate causes weaker shells in oysters and clams. Like, well, who cares about oysters and clams? Well, they are critical because they help filter the water and help maintain a healthy ecosystem. And the coral reef is the tropical rainforest of the ocean. So as the coral dies, you lose habitats for literally millions of different species. So that is a problem due to the excess CO2. Now this process, this equation right here, is also how we regulate our breathing. So as we start exercising, we start generating more CO2 that combines with the water in our blood, and it makes carbonic acid. The carbonic acid dissociates, it breaks into the bicarbonate, and the hydrogen, and then the blood of our pH starts to drop. That's bad because our pH of our blood has to stay within that very narrow range. And so we have chemical sensors in our carotid arteries, which are the ones that you can feel right here. And you also have chemical sensors in part of your lower brain called the medulla oblongata. And when they sense this pH drop, they send a signal to your diaphragm, which is the muscle right here under your lungs, to start contracting deeper and faster, and that starts making you breathe harder. And that is to, A, get more oxygen into your body, but also to exhale more CO2 so that you have enough oxygen for your muscles because you're exercising, and also so your pH level of your blood is correct. So that is an important aspect of your basic physiology. All right, so that is it for this lecture. Talk to you later.